on Nepal and the Gurungs. When I decided to do anthropological fieldwork for a doctorate, I cast about and was advised by my supervisor that it would be interesting to go to Nepal, a place I hardly knew of and certainly couldn't place on a map until he showed me where it was. Nepal, of course, is a long, thin strip on the border between Tibet and India, and it contains many of the highest mountains in the world, the Himalayas. So my then wife and I set out in 1968 to spend 15 months in a mountain village among the people called the Gurungs. The Gurungs were settled on the top of ridges in that area, and they were famous as recruits into the British Gurkha regiments, along with some of the other so-called martial tribes. And we spent 15 months studying, as anthropologists did then, the intense life of a village community, its economics, its religion, its social systems, its culture. And I learnt a huge amount from that. It totally changed me. I learnt about myself and about my world from that experience, and also from 19 further visits which I paid with my wife Sarah almost every year for 20 years, and this has changed me and my perception and attitudes. How has it changed me? Well, almost everything I took for granted about my own world in the West was questioned. For example, religion. I'd taken religion to be some unified thing which I had, which included believing in a single God, rituals to reach this God, prayers, a certain dogma, certain beliefs about the origins and future of human beings, and so on. In this village, there was no such thing as religion of that kind. There were many sub-things which dealt with those things. There was some Buddhism, there was some Hinduism, there was some animism, shamanism, some ancestor worship, and they all mixed together and worked together. So it was a package of different things, and that undermined my monotheistic beliefs entirely. Secondly, in no particular order, the technology. I'd come from what I hadn't realized, but was a very advanced technological system in the West, not merely on the surface with roads and cars and trains and electricity and modern medicine and so on, but in every respect our lives were cocooned in fairly advanced technologies. They may look rather primitive from 50 years on, but at the time they seemed state-of-the-art. And when I went up into this village, to which there was no road, it obviously had no electricity, it had no sewage system, it had no running water system. Everything was done more or less by human beings. I saw how extraordinary our own technology was, and compared to most of the world, how much we were helped and aided by that technology. I then became interested in technology, and much of my life, or some of my life, has been devoted to that. Another way in which it influenced me was the general character of the people. It's difficult to describe, but if I describe them as I have found them over those years, they were much more emotional in a way than the people I knew in my own culture. They expressed emotion not in words really, but by their actions. They showed great affection when we returned. They were very loving in every aspect of their lives. They were very loving to their children. I didn't see children being punished. They protected and brought up their children with a great deal of love, and they were extremely kind. They helped each other as much as possible. They worked extremely well together in the fields or in collecting wood or whatever it was. They worked as teams very effectively. They were very egalitarian. There was no gender difference really between the men and the women. The women often ran the households, particularly when the men were away on army service or paid labour abroad. It was the women who ran the village. And although there was a sort of small part of the Hindu caste system, there were some people who were called untouchables, or Dalits, blacksmiths and tailors, and some Brahmins. There wasn't much of a differentiation, and certainly within the Gurungs it was very egalitarian. So there were all these features which contrasted to a large extent with my own world. So when I came back from my first visit and later visits, my own world looked strange, and I began to question many aspects of it which I'd absolutely taken for granted, like the technology, like the family system, like the religious system. And so I learned a great deal about my own world by going away and looking at it in the mirror from a distance. And this is one of the things that anthropology is meant to teach you. But I also learned a great deal about myself. A searing experience, which is what this was. 15 months cut off entirely. Letters took 3 or 4 weeks to get to us. There was no contacts with other white people except the occasional trekker through the village. And we were thrown on ourselves and our own devices, my wife and I. And I learnt a great deal about myself through that experience. I learnt that I loved England, that I was very homesick, and certainly it was a struggle not to just give up and come back. I learnt that I didn't find things like the absence of toilets and the absence of water and the barking of the dogs in the night easy, and each of them was a struggle. But I'd been used to some sorts of struggles in my boys' boarding schools, which perhaps helped. I learnt, as I suppose I knew before, I was a workaholic. One of the most difficult things was that as a Western historian or scholar or even schoolboy, I could do as much work when I liked. I could go to the library when I liked. I could read. I could get on with my projects and have a sense of momentum. In a mountain village like that, where you're trying to gather information principally from people, you can't just order them to turn up and give you information. You have to be dependent on their patterns of life. And I found this very frustrating at times and also rather worrying. I felt often that I wasn't gathering enough information to make a PhD. It all seemed rather shallow and superficial. Another thing I learnt was that I was, as I'd always known, not a very good linguist. I did stumble along, and by 6 months I got to pass the test of being able to string together enough words to make a joke, which some of the people were kind enough to laugh at. So I was beginning to get the hang of it, and by the end of it I was able to follow simple conversations and hold simple conversations. I never got beyond that, and I realized that I was never going to be one of those anthropologists who really got inside the hearts and minds of another culture through good linguistic abilities. And I suppose the last thing I will mention is that I learnt that I was part of an imperial tradition. I was clearly looked at by the people at that time as a sort of district commissioner or army officer who'd come there to make a report and survey them. They weren't suspicious, but they treated me with a certain respect. They were, after all, recruits into the British Army, and they'd met a number of middle-class Englishmen, and they could see that I was one of those sorts of people. So though I was only in my mid-20s, I was treated with the respect of someone somewhat elder, and I took this for granted. It was really only later, in subsequent villages, that we began to get off that veranda, so to speak, of the district commissioner. I shouldn't overdo it, but there was a distance. But getting involved with the family, going back year after year after year, made it possible for us to, more or less, insofar as it's ever possible, to become one of the village. They treated us as one of the village. If there was an important ritual, if there was a death of one of my family, I had to go back and be involved with it. So we had the enormous privilege of being absorbed. And that distance between colour, between status, between rich and poor, disappeared mostly. I'm sure it's still there to a certain extent, but it's eliminated as far as we possibly could. And that has been a really wonderful experience, to be accepted and absorbed by a very distant people as one of their own. And they've often said, when we die, we should send some of our clothes and they will do a funeral ritual, because our souls need to be taken from that village up over the high Himalayas to the Planasa, the spirit village of the Gurungs. And I hope that one day will happen.